I know that a guy that'll be watching it alongside you, Scott Grayson, is our next guest. That's John McMullen, our 97.3 Eagles insider, FanRagSports.com. Hello, John. How are you on this Wednesday, hump day, or would you call it eve of game day?
Unfortunately, I'm calling it eve of game day. I'm very, you know me in those Thursday night games. I don't enjoy them that much, but it's part of the NFL landscape, and we got to get through it. 2 more of these to go, and we'll see how the Eagles show up and perform. Biggest news would be obviously Lane Johnson starting at right tackle.
How do you think Lane looks? Doug was asked about that today.
He mentioned he was very, looks good, very energetic, has kept his weight up. I think that was a concern. Anytime you're away from the facility for 10 weeks, I mean, that's 2.5 months. So there's always the fear that a guy doesn't keep himself in shape. That's never been Lane's MO, and he came in, and the Eagles think he's ready, and he better be, because he certainly didn't get much practice this week. Because there wasn't opportunity to get much practice, and the Giants are pretty good up front. So we'll see how he holds up. It's interesting because Alan Barber's going to be listed as questionable, but they expect him to play. So we're finally going to get to see the offensive line we should have seen for the entire season, and that starts with Lane and Jason Peters, who made another Pro Bowl last night. And Alan Barber, Brandon Brooks, Jason Kelsey. That's on paper. That's a really, really good offensive line.
John, wanted to ask you about Jason Peters, who you mentioned just made it to the Pro Bowl, or was just named to it yet again. I know earlier today in Doug's press conference, he was asked about Jason Peters and about next year. And I mean, Doug pretty much, gave him a ringing endorsement to being back next year. What's your thought on whether or not Jason Peters is back with the Eagles next year?
Well, I've always thought it's kind of one of those things that's up to Jason. If he wants to continue to play, he's playing at a high enough level that the Eagles would want him back. And even Lane, before the suspension, would often talk about the fact that the ultimate plan is to flip-flop Lane over to the left side, and hopefully Big V, Vitae, or somebody else can handle the right side. But Lane had always says, look, nobody can play left tackle on this team better than Jason Peters. I think he's proven that again this season. He's had a very good season overall. But the one concern is if you've ever seen Jason try to get ready at practice, and I'm talking on a daily basis, not every once in a while, he's got to go through this torturous stretching routine just to get his body prepared to practice. And at some point, he has to ask the question, how long does he want to go about it? And I think that's the bigger concern from the Eagles standpoint, because he seemed rejuvenated. It was pretty obvious he wasn't happy with Chip Kelly and the way things were being run and how that was affecting his body at the end of the Kelly regime. So he's very happy being in a more traditional NFL environment, and I think he's going to be back next season.
Found it interesting that Doug was asked at the end of his news conference. I'm pulling it up here real fast. What have you learned about being a head coach? When you look at Doug Pederson over the last 14 games, do you see growth out of Doug Pederson? Do you think that he has learned anything?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's a natural learning curve for anybody to be a head coach in this league, and you're going to make mistakes. And by and large, you either learn from them and grow and adapt and move on in your career, or you stay very headstrong to certain philosophies and you generally flame out. I think Doug has proven that he learns from various mistakes. I think as the talent level grows, specifically on the offensive side, I think things will get better. And overall, through the first season, I know I'm in the minority here, but I think Doug's done a pretty good job with all the hurdles put in front of him. dating back to the off season. Forget about the trade 8 days before the regular season, but to go all the way back to all the acrimony of the extension with Sam Bradford, and then the drafting of Carson Wentz, and Bradford leaving the facility and the off-season program for a few days. He's had a lot of sort of off-the-field things to deal with, and I think by and large he's done pretty well.
The other guy that made the Pro Bowl, Fletcher Cox, John, and that came out after we were off the air last night. But Fletcher kind of said to reporters he didn't deserve it. He thought that he wasn't having a Pro Bowl season. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with it and I disagree with it. I think he's played at a Pro Bowl level. He's played at a very high level. I think what he was trying to say is because the numbers, what people expect, weren't necessarily there, that he was surprised that he made it. But if you look at the way opposing offenses scheme for the Philadelphia Eagles, I mean, their first order of business is trying to double team Fletcher Cox. So I think that tells you a lot about what kind of havoc he creates and how important he is, even if he isn't making plays, because he opens up things for other players on the defense. I just look at it from a larger perspective where I agree with him. Aaron Donald is the best defensive tackle in football. He deserved to make the Pro Bowl. He did. Gerald McCoy is having a tremendous season in Tampa Bay. He made the Pro Bowl, and he deserved it. And the third interior guy was Fletcher. I thought that should have gone to Damon Harrison, who will be in on Thursday with the New York Giants. And he's more of a nose tackle type, and it's tough for those guys to get noticed because stuff in the run is such a thankless task. But if you look at how poor the Giants' defense was last season, how good it's been this season, he's one of the major reasons. It starts up front. They stop the run, and that's because of him. So I think he was more deserving. But that doesn't mean that Fletcher didn't play at a Pro Bowl level.
Hard to say that any Eagles were snubbed on a team that's only won 5 games. But then Scott and I were talking earlier about how the Browns actually have more Pro Bowl players than wins. They have 1 Pro Bowl player and 0 wins. So the Pro Bowl is always a dicey topic. But I know if you're picking a guy that you thought got snubbed, I think Scott said Jordan Hicks, Brandon Graham. Does learn that he's an alternate, so doesn't make it in right on first ballot, if you will, but there's some guys on the Eagles that are on the periphery.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at one snub, so to speak, and you're right, it's tough to make it when you only win 5 games, and it tends to be the guys with the big reputation, and that describes both Jason and Fletcher because so many people around the league know them. But, yeah, to me, the biggest snub would be Brandon Graham because he's been one of the best edge defenders in this league, and despite the record. And he's been very, very consistent throughout the season. So if that's one guy that should have made it and probably will make it because, as we all know, how many guys drop out, he'll eventually get the nod to get in there. And Jordan's had a very good season as well. But if I had to pick one guy, it would definitely be Brandon Graham.
John, about 24 hours from now, I know you like to get there early. You're probably making your way to the stadium already at this point. How do you see tomorrow's game playing out? I mean, you got the short week. You got the Eagles back at home where they've only lost 1 time this year, coming off a pretty decent attempt on Sunday against the Ravens. Jason Pierre-Paul is out. How do you think this all looks for the Eagles tomorrow night?
Well, it's so tough when you don't have anything to play for. You really almost have to get a feel for how the team shows up, and then you add into it the short week. Now, generally, you don't want to be the road team on a short week, but it is the Giants coming in here, which is just 90 minutes up the turnpike, so it's not like they're flying halfway across the country. So I don't think that will have much impact as it sometimes does on the Thursday night games. I kind of lean on the fact that the Giants still have quite a bit to play for. and they're probably going to find a way to win this game. But you mentioned the Eagles have obviously been much better at home than on the road, specifically defensively. I could see them giving Eli Manning fits because the Giants haven't been good offensively this year. I mean, it's been mainly their defense that has carried them. So I don't expect a high-scoring game. But we always lean back, and I just find it very difficult to find points for this team with the skill position talent the way it is. So I lean on the fact you can say if there's a defensive touchdown, if there's a special teams touchdown, that can shake things. And the Eagles have been very good on those types of things over the past few seasons, but you can't count on it from week to week. You can't go into a game and say, we're going to score a special teams touchdown. We're going to score a defensive touchdown. And the Eagles are so bad offensively right now, you almost need that to get a win.
John McMullen with us, our 97.3 Eagles Insider, FanRagSports.com. 10-4 Giants, John, 5-9 Eagles. Now, the last time these two met, Giants won the game 28-23 in Week 9. That's one of 6 losses for the Eagles in games decided by 7 points or fewer. And Doug asked today, you look at the Giants, they're 8-2 in games decided by 7 points or less. You guys are 0-6, and you could have just stopped the question there, whoever asked it, and say why. But they said, does that show a fine line between a team that's going to the playoffs and you not going? How did you rate Doug's answer to that?
Well, it is he's correct. And generally, NFL games, it's a play or two that decides it. And really, you can go back even further for the Giants. They were terrible at winning close games, really the last 2 seasons in the Tom Coughlin era. And that's a big reason he's no longer coaching that in that organization. So they've done a tremendous job turning that aspect of it around. And you can look at it one of 2 ways. You can say, well, the Giants are really, really good at closing games, and the Eagles are really, really bad. But it can also tell you how quickly things can change, because the Giants were awful at it last season. And now, as you mentioned, they're 8-2. So if the Eagles have a tweak here or there, all of a sudden that 0-6 could turn into 6-1 or 6-2 in close games. And that's just life in the NFL. It's a parity-driven league. And as we say, 2 or 3 plays are going to decide most games. And you saw that in Baltimore when it came down to a 2-point conversion.
Very much so. Now, that brings up the next thing I want to talk about. Doug was asked today if you changing the narrative, because if the Eagles don't win the next 2 divisional games, they're going to end up winless in the division for the 3rd time in franchise history. And Doug was asked, did you think going into the season the division would be as formidable as it turned out to be? And does this change the narrative for the Eagles in trying to build a team here going forward, which I thought was an excellent question. What did you think of his answer, and what do you think of that topic?
Well, I think I don't know anybody who thought the NFC East was going to be good this season. When you look back to last season, it was terrible. It was one of the worst divisions in football. And Washington sort of persevered to win the division. Dallas was a 4-12 team. We mentioned the Giants and their head coach. They moved on and they shifted directions. And all of a sudden now, you've got the best team in the NFC. You've got another 10-win team. And you got the Redskins, who still have a chance, although the odds are against them, to make this a 3-playoff team division. And all of a sudden, the Eagles are at the bottom of it looking up. But I think you can look at both sides of the coin again and see how quickly things can change in this league. And remember, the Eagles are playing with a rookie quarterback. They're playing with a first-year guy who is going through the hiccups that most rookie quarterbacks go through. And while it can be painful at times, and it certainly was last Sunday in Baltimore, you saw some of the worst Carson Wentz throws. to date, especially the early interception. But, Troy Aikman was 1-15 in his first season. Peyton Manning was 3-13. You almost have to go through these hiccups to get to the point you want to be if you're going to be a franchise quarterback. And for the most part, I like where the Eagles are going. And I don't think the chasm is as big as other people think it is. I think the Eagles can be back competing in this division with 3 or 4 of the right personnel moves in the offseason.
Well, I think Eagles fans will appreciate hearing that. The question is whether Howie can make those appropriate moves. We'll see if he can get that done. Let me ask you about Carson Wentz, John. And 14 games in, thankfully he's still playing, so he's got 14 games of experience. Some quarterbacks aren't able to get through all 16. Hopefully he can do that. When you see where he is now and where he started at 8 days before the preseason or before the season opener, what do you think of his progress? Is he still making progress, or is he going back to some bad habits too much, like throwing off the back foot, things like that?
I think he's kind of hit a bit of a wall, and I haven't seen a ton of progress recently. But I think most of it goes back to the mechanics, as you mentioned, the bad footwork specifically. And that's the kind of thing you really, really can't tackle until you get to the off season. And that's going to be the prime directive for this organization, is to sort of, rebuild the mechanics of Carson Wentz. And I don't think that's a surprise. They knew that. They talked about it from the time they drafted him. That was one of the issues coming from North Dakota State, a small school, was the coaching. And he was a little behind the curve when it came to things like fundamentals and things like footwork. So I don't think they're upset by it. They just kind of realize it, and you can either go positive or negative with it. And the positive is he's shown the ability to extend plays, and he did it last week, getting the Eagles into the end zone, giving them an opportunity to win the game. And that's what you need in this league more than anything else. And that's what they didn't have with Sam Bradford, and they haven't really had since Donovan McNabb was in his prime. And now they do have it. So I think the future is very, very bright when it comes to Carson Wentz, and that doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to have any more hiccups, but I think he's on schedule to be a very, very good quarterback in this league.
John McMullen, our 97.3 Eagles insider, FanRagSports.com. I'm going to let you play offensive coordinator for a minute here and design the Eagles' game plan against the Giants, keeping in mind that Ryan Matthews had a big game last week. Darren Sproles now comes back. Lane Johnson is back on that line. How are you designing up the offensive attack then to beat the Giants?
Well, I do want to rely on the running game, and even though that is a strength of the Giants' defense, and I mentioned Snacks Harrison and how dominant he's been, I think you have to stick with the running game when you have such ineffective players at the wide receiver position. I know Scott and I agree it's time to pull the plug on Nelson Aguilar, and I would prefer to see what Jordan Matthews can do outside the numbers, along with Dorial Green-Beckham, and I want to see Paul Turner in the slot. Now, while I say that, I don't expect it to happen. I expect the same usual wide receiver group, and that means Jordan in the slot, Nelson in GGB on the outside. But at this stage, it is what it is, and I don't think you are going to see a lot of changes. I think if the Eagles have success offensively against the Giants, I think a lot is going to be due to that offensive line and due to the fact that Lane Johnson is back. If he can hit the ground running, and then all of a sudden you have Alan Barber back at his best position, I think that would be the group sort of defining the success that they do have. But I think it's got to start with the running game.
John, let's end with the Giants. How would you defend the Giants offense? You've got obviously you've got Odell Beckham Jr. over there, and the Eagles did a decent job against him in the first meeting, but he's going to kind of get his. How do you rattle Eli Manning if it's possible with that quick release?
Well, I might go basketball. I might go boxing one on OBJ because he's the only guy who can hurt you. It's not a good offense. It's not a good offensive line. The quarterback has not played well for the most part. I think I kind of mentioned on yesterday's show, Eli's not going to take sacks, so it's not about hitting him. It's about speeding him up. It's about making him throw before he wants to. And the thing about Eli is when he gets rattled and when you get pressure on him, he will speed up, and he will throw the ball much, much quicker than he wants to. And that's where the interceptions start to pile up because receivers aren't ready for the football. Sometimes he and his receivers aren't on the same page on those sight adjustments. But you got to be careful because it could look bad, it could look bad, it could look bad, and all of a sudden it's a 7-yard slant to OBJ and he's gone. And we've seen sort of a downgrade in play over the past number of weeks from Rodney McLeod. The one thing about the safeties in this game, Rodney and Malcolm Jenkins and Jalen Watkins, when he comes into the game, they have to tackle, and they have to make sure they limit those yards after catch that Beckham is so good at, and it's easier said than done.
He's John McMullen. He's our Eagles insider for 97.3. Joins us each day at this time. Of course, tomorrow, like you said, Scott, normally that's when he'd be going up to the game, but he's going to join us and go to the game and pull that all off in one fell swoop, just like your holiday shopping earlier. It'll be no problem.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Scott Grayson had some holiday issues today. Well, I'm sure he'll tell you when he sees you. Johnny Mac, thank you so much for joining us, pal, and we'll look forward to talking to you again tomorrow.
All right, thanks. Take care of that voice, Pete.